Please welcome to the stage Andy Parsons from Adobe, as well as Sarah Brandt from NewsGuard, along with moderator Kyle Wiggers. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thanks for joining me on stage, guys. Andy and Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, likewise.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming to this, honestly, maybe pessimistic panel. I mean, during our prep call for this a couple weeks ago, the gist I got was disinformation as it relates to AI is an intractable problem. But I hope we're also going to talk about solutions to it. So maybe a good place to start is, Sarah, could you tell us a little bit about your background and NewsGuard as an organization, because I think some people might not be familiar with NewsGuard and what they do, specifically too as it relates to generative AI and kind of threats and concerns around that technology.
Sure, absolutely. So NewsGuard is about 6 years old as a company, and what we do is we track mis and disinformation, so the top false narratives being spread, and we also track the bad actors spreading those narratives. We do this using, believe it or not, old school human beings, journalists reporting. We're not using any AI to detect misinformation or to flag bad actors, but just basic reporting skills. And recently, we've been, well, pretty much since the public release of ChatGPT last year, we've been doing a lot of research, reporting, and monitoring of the role that generative AI can play in accelerating and enhancing disinformation campaigns. So we've been doing red teaming exercises of ChatGPT, Google Bard, to see how easily you can get those models to spread disinformation. We've been looking at how are foreign propagandists using and exploiting these tools to spread disinformation, and much more.
Right, yeah, and you're working with partners, including Microsoft, I believe, right, to robustify their models and ensure they don't generate information that could be misleading or even just factually untrue, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we've been working with Microsoft for a while, and they've been using our ratings of news sources and our catalog of false narratives in their Bing search engine. And so when they released Bing Chat, their generative AI model, they were able to lean on our data to essentially fine-tune the models and provide safeguards to prevent users who are searching for topics related to the news from encountering a response with misinformation. Whereas sometimes, we know that ChatGPT, other tools can hallucinate, but also when you ask them about topics in the news, they might get it wrong, or they might amplify a misinformation narrative. Bing is using our data to try to prevent that.
Right. The key word there is try. I mean, no one's perfect, especially when it comes to generative AI.
Right.
So Andy, you work at Adobe, obviously. I'm sure a lot of people know Adobe, either use its tools or obviously it's been around a while, made some big moves in recent years, especially I'd say with, for example, the Figma acquisition. But we're not here to talk about that. I was hoping you could kind of shed light on what you do at Adobe. There is an initiative you run that's very tangential related to the topic today. So perhaps you could give us some insight into that, how it was founded, and kind of what you're trying to achieve with it today.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. What we do is very complementary, but very different from what NewsGuard does. So in 2019, the Content Authenticity Initiative, which I run at Adobe, was founded in concert with the New York Times and Twitter. That seems like light years ago, pre-Gen AI. Of course, the technologies behind Gen AI are in some cases decades old, but the kind of surge of interest and potential use by bad actors for disinformation has been a thing that has come to the fore in the past couple of years. I can't say we were so prescient that we knew that this was all coming, but even in 2019, we were beginning to see a prevalence of things like the now well-known, infamous Nancy Pelosi so-called cheap fake, which if you hadn't seen it, in 2019, the Speaker of the House was presented using nothing related to AI, a very unsophisticated slowing down of frames and audio to make her appear unwell or intoxicated. And it went viral. The President of the United States put it on Facebook and retweeted it. Adobe has a long, decades-long history of creating really powerful tools for creators. So in 2019, 2020, we looked at this problem kind of through two lenses. One was if Adobe and other remarkable companies are going to create these technologies for creators, we have to make sure that they can be used responsibly and that they're deployed responsibly. And this predates AI. Photoshop, obviously, often used synonymously with, changed or messed with. And with the oncoming kind of onslaught of disinformation that we saw coming, we imagined that we really should turn our attention away from detection of manipulation and deepfakes or cheapfakes and towards what we came to call provenance, which is proving ground truth about how media was made. Now, that's not to say detection isn't worthwhile, but that without a core foundation and objective truth that we can share, frankly, without exaggerating, democracy is at stake, and being able to have objective conversations with other human beings about shared truth is at stake. So what I do at Adobe is threefold. I oversee our efforts in open standards, specifically around proving ground truth about media. Of course, my team also works to deploy these tools in Adobe Photoshop and Premiere and all of our tools. And third, we have a big open source effort to make sure that the tools, the very same code that's running in Photoshop to create provenance and understand how things were made, whether Firefly or other AI tools were used, that same technology, without any licensing or patents or any intellectual property, is available to anybody who wants to deploy it. And the Content Authenticity Initiative itself now has something like 1,800 members, all unified around this idea of providing transparency, many of them using our open source code.
Right. I think you brought up a lot of issues I want to get to in this panel. Hopefully we will have time. But Sarah, I want to turn the conversation to you briefly, if that's okay. NewsGuard, you're on the ground, as far as I can tell, kind of really closely tracking these disinformation campaigns driven by generative AI tools nowadays. It seems to be the case, right? ChatGPT and the like. Perhaps you can tell us what you think are some of the biggest threats you're seeing today. What kind of actors are using these tools for disinformation, and what kind of tools they're using?
Yeah, I'd say when it comes to applying these tools to spread disinformation, the phrase that comes to mind is force multiplier. So large language models, generated images and videos can create disinformation campaigns that are more compelling, more sophisticated, have higher volumes, and are cheaper because you can just have one person put in a prompt into a large language model and pump out hundreds, if not thousands, of compelling articles, whereas previously you may have needed to employ an army of people to create that content. So we're seeing a few different trends come up. One big thing is something we're calling UAINs, which stands for Unreliable AI-Generated News Sites. We're tracking these websites that are posing as run-of-the-mill news sites. They have kind of benign names like iBusiness Day or worldtodaynews.com. They present themselves as news websites, but in actuality, all or almost all of their content is produced by AI, by Gen AI, with little to no human oversight. And they're pretty lazy, they're pretty sloppy. You'll see the telltale AI error messages in their articles, like, I'm sorry, my training data only dates to 2021, and they don't even take the time to delete that. But it's really a volume game. They're just pumping out hundreds, in some cases thousands of articles a day. And it's all an ad revenue game in some cases. They're just trying to get a lot of content, make it onto search engines, and make some programmatic ad revenue. And in some cases, we're seeing them spread mis and disinformation. But I think when it comes to my greatest concern, when it comes to using these tools for spreading disinformation, it's putting these tools in the hands of bad actors, malign state propagandists who use this to spread harmful narratives. And also, I'm quite concerned as we enter the 2024 election cycle to see how these tools are deployed, not just in the US, but we've got over 40 major elections happening globally next year.
Right, yeah. I remember during the prep call you mentioned some specific state actors that NewsGuard has observed using these tools at scale. I think maybe China being one of them. And it's not, it's the usual suspects, I suppose, but now they're able to greatly scale their efforts, as you spoke to a second ago. Andy, so to turn the conversation to you now. all kinds of media is being produced with generative AI tools, right? Text, images, in some cases maybe even video. Firefly, obviously, is a set of generative AI tools that Adobe released relatively recently. From what I understand, it's in a constant state of development, right? More or less in beta. But I was hoping you could speak to ways in which Adobe is trying to prevent the misuse of these tools, because it's a tool, and as such, it could be used for good or bad, theoretically, right? But are there safeguards that Adobe has put in place to prevent somebody taking this and trying to mount a disinformation campaign with Firefly?
There are. I'll start out by saying nobody has this exactly figured out 100%. You can make many tools produce things that could be used in a deleterious way in some situation. But we have focused from the beginning. You'll note that Adobe wasn't the first to the starting line with Gen AI image generation, nor some of the other things you'll see coming out at Adobe Max and beyond into next year. But the tools are robust. They're really focused on the creator ecosystem, not, for example, you might say Midjourney is focused at everybody. If you know how to use Discord, you can generate anything at any moment. It can be photorealistic or creative or what have you. The Adobe tools are really meant to be creative co-pilots for Creative Cloud users and others. So you can generate, whole cloth images in Firefly, of course. You can use different photo styles. But the data underlying those models is licensed through Adobe Stock. So there's no copyright infringement possible. Adobe Stock will indemnify. This is more business details than what you're asking, but indemnification is possible because you can't produce a picture of Pope Francis. It's just not possible. If you try, you'll get something that doesn't look like a pope at all. You can't produce Mickey Mouse. You can't produce violent images. Now, the countermeasures are, number one, to make sure that before any upgrades to Firefly or the tools that employ it, go through a rigid, rigorous ethics review process, which makes releasing new things slow, but I think more importantly, it makes them ethical and safer. I won't say completely safe because, again, I think we don't know where all of this is going, but the Firefly tools, as much as they can possibly benefit from this rigorous process of training only on licensed data, of prompt filtering and all the things that we and others are trying to employ to prevent violent images or other types of inappropriate images from being generated, but still serve the needs of our creative community. That's what we're doing. We still have a lot to learn and a lot more to do, but I feel great. I think as a company, we feel good about where we are right now.
Right. I think it's important to bring up, though, that or ask the question, can you go too far the other way, right? Can you filter to the point where you kind of neuter a tool, right, and make it ineffective for at least certain segments of customers? Just in my research and using these tools myself, some of the prompt filtering is quite restrictive, maybe more so than other tools on the market, and there are complaints in some forums that this kind of impedes the work that some customers want to do. When you think about ways to fight disinformation, that's probably something you have to consider, right? What is Adobe's philosophy on that?
I think you have to consider what the tool is for. Again, using Midjourney as an example, it's there to put generative AI in the hands of anybody really who wants it. There's a business behind it as well, but there are companies that lead with, you can do anything, and it's the most powerful possible tool. Adobe's point of view is this is for creators doing creative work. And it's a smaller subset. It's not trying to solve all the world's problems. We're not trying to be the Salesforce of generative AI, if you will, but to target a very specific set of use cases that we hear about. And in terms of feedback from our creative community, we can be very responsive because people aren't saying, this is great, but I'd love to make an image of Joe Biden hugging Vladimir Putin. Whereas users of other tools might be after that exact use case. We're not interested in it, or customers aren't interested in it. So I would say we have a little bit of an easier problem than some others. And the tool is going to be the best of its kind for these purposes for people doing creative work.
Right, so when the use cases are narrower, perhaps it's an easier problem to solve, is what you're suggesting. That makes sense. To move on, watermarking. We both talked about watermarking when we were prepping for this panel. Watermarking is getting a lot of talk nowadays. When I refer to watermarking, I mean very visible watermarks on AI-generated images, but also metadata or cryptographically signed watermarks. So this is a question for both of you. Do you think watermarks are a partial whole solution to the problem of disinformation. I mean, I have my opinion on that. But you as the experts, I'd love to hear, maybe starting with Sarah.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a partial tool, but there's not going to be a panacea that can solve all problems. We at NewsGuard focus on one sliver of the problem, which is we're evaluating websites, we're rating which of these websites are reliable, which of them are spreading disinformation. We're largely focused on text-based narratives and web-based bad actors, but when it comes to verifying whether a piece of content is artificially generated, like it's a deep fake or an artificially generated image, that's where Andy's team comes in. And there's so many other, I think one positive note from all of the attention that was paid to the spread of online mis and disinformation in the past years with the role of social media is that this kind of cottage industry of companies like ours was founded, where there's multiple companies out there and, of course, government actors who are trying to tackle mis and disinformation. And they're going about it in different ways. And it kind of takes an army, but all the different approaches can work.
Right.
Yeah, I think, Kyle, had you asked me weeks ago, maybe a couple weeks before our prep call, I might have said, I would have lamented the fact that the word watermarking has started to subsume and conflate a bunch of different ideas, among them visible watermarking, steganographic watermarking, and even content provenance metadata. But I do think, since you're asking me now, I feel like the word watermarking is sort of becoming a lightning rod. It's like people feel like there is some countermeasure using proactive means. For this audience and for you, I think it is important to dissect a little bit what we even mean when we use that word, so I'll do that very briefly now. There are visible watermarks, the likes of which Getty Images and Adobe Stock and Shutterstock have for years put on images. Those are trivially easy to remove. You can use Adobe Content-Aware Fill or the new Photoshop Generative Fill to do a really nice job of removing those things. They're not very robust. Yeah. And many other tools. The idea of a steganographic watermark is to hide a message in the pixels of an image or the frames of video or the waveform of an audio file. I'll focus on images, but everything I'll say applies equally to the other media types. And that can be very robust to a particular kind of attack, which is called the rebroadcast attack, which really is nothing more than taking a picture of a picture or a high-resolution screen, purporting that this thing happened, but you're actually taking a picture of maybe a Midjourney image or something else. And screenshotting, right? Those will wipe away any metadata that's there. But certain kinds of robust watermarks, I think Google's SynthID announced a few weeks ago qualifies, will survive those kinds of attacks. So rotating, changing color content, cropping to some degree, the watermark will survive. To make it survive, you need to have very low bandwidth. Like I suspect the SynthID watermark really encodes 1 bit of information, which is this was generated by AI. But I think to truly achieve provenance and things that will be helpful to NewsGuard and others, we need more information. And as soon as you expand the amount of information that a watermark contains, it becomes less robust. And now a simple crop will destroy it. So we believe that the combination of robust provenance data that can be higher bandwidth, more data, that's cryptographically signed, just like you'd sign a document, coupled with a watermark that indicates its presence. Those two things together are much better than either on its own. And that's what we're talking and thinking about. And I think, to Sarah's point, this is not a panacea, but it is a very strong measure towards not only countering disinformation, but again, giving us this objective understanding of what content is and where it came from.
Right. I mean, the problem from where I'm sitting, though, is that all these initiatives and standards and technologies are voluntary, right? It's sort of incumbent on companies to adopt them or use them, right? And I can you brought up a couple of different approaches to this problem, right? And SynthID, I think, currently is only being used by Google. Not sure if they've allowed anyone else to adopt it yet. I think it was just announced, and the method was detailed, and Google said, we're using it, isn't that great? But because it's voluntary, and I'm sure certain bad actors would never dream of using, I mean, they probably want to disable these technologies. That's probably, what they have in mind in terms of their end game. Is that really a solution? I mean, I want to believe that it could help, but I'm not fully convinced that the industry will coalesce around a standard and bad actors won't find a way around them.
So, I mean, you're right, it's voluntary, right? The absence of information providing provenance to a consumer or a fact checker over time will be an indication that maybe this isn't trustworthy, right? But in the interim, as we get there, we don't want to disadvantage content that can't have a watermark or provenance data associated with it. Somebody in a conflict region, a citizen journalist who doesn't have the latest and greatest phone in their pocket or the new Leica camera, that might be out of reach. So I think the hardest problem is how do we get from where we are now, where nothing has provenance data. But by the way, most of the images you see, at least at some point in their life cycle, had metadata. Social media platforms will happily strip it out. But this is why this is a coalition and a multi-year effort. And I hope things will accelerate towards the US and the many other elections coming up next year towards adoption. And once you have ubiquity, granted there's a long way between here and there, then information that could have provenance, that should have it, that doesn't, should be looked at with an eye of skepticism.
Right. So Sarah, maybe it's too early, but I'm wondering, in NewsGuard's research, has it found evidence that any of these watermarking standards are catching on? Like, is it easier to detect certain kinds of content than it used to be because a certain technique or technology has been adopted by at least one major player? I just want to know if you've seen it in the wild. I'm genuinely curious.
I think it is maybe a bit too early. I mean, we are always trying in our research to get to the bottom of the provenance, whether it's the provenance of an image or the provenance of a narrative. We're more focused on narratives, so we probably encounter image watermarking and video watermarking less frequently. But I think, it does hold promise. I'm hopeful it'll bear fruit and, like Andy said, be helpful to our research skills.
Right. Not to focus too much on this topic, but I think, from a technical perspective, it's fascinating. What do you think about efforts to, watermark text? And we briefly spoke about it a second ago, but I know OpenAI has obviously experimented with ways to do this, not super successfully so far, but they say they'll keep working on it. Do you think it'll ever be possible to watermark something generated by a GPT-4 or 5, I suppose, as the case may be?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I don't want to say anything's impossible. One thing we're looking at related to this question is the way that generative AI can be used to plagiarize news articles from more legitimate news sources. So those UAINs I talked about, a lot of them are pretty obviously putting in prompts saying, here's an article that I found from the FT, will you rewrite it? Essentially, so it's not so obvious that I'm plagiarizing this content. Mm-hmm. And they'll even say, oh, rewrite it and make it SEO friendly. So clearly they're trying to, like I mentioned, get to the top of your Google search results. So it's interesting. We've actually spoken to, our reporters have interviewed copyright lawyers to say, is this plagiarism? Is it not? I think that question is still to be determined, needs to be worked out in the courts. But there are some key phrases you can look for. And I don't know if this is necessarily considered watermarking, but if you see a string of 3 words together in a row that are identical to what was in the original piece of content, that's pretty clearly plagiarized. And also what we're looking for when it comes to news is who did they interview? So if you see in the rewritten article the same interview subjects as in the original article, that's a pretty funny coincidence, right?
Right, for sure. And, I'm sure you're aware of instances of, well, you mentioned kind of boilerplate text that shows up in AI-generated content, and I'm sure it's shown up in Amazon reviews if memory is serving correctly, even ebooks submitted to the Amazon bookstore. So there are some pretty obvious ways to tell in some cases. Others, it's a bit more challenging. And
if I may, Kyle, I think we're in sort of the six-fingered man phase of text right now that we saw weeks or months ago, where it was like, it's easy to tell. Look at the ears, look at the eyes, see about the alignment, look for that 6th or 7th finger. Now those things have been solved. I think text is just a much harder problem. Once again, I'll add some optimism to your pessimism. The standards group we formed called the C2PA has a text task force. It has the humility to understand that this is a really hard problem and might be unsolvable. But that if you have a packaged piece of news content that consists of text, video, and images, you can ensure that those things are inseparably combined and that the contents therein becomes tamper evident. Meaning if you change the words, if you change the image, if you decouple them, it can be evident to a consumer fact checker that this is not what it started out as. That doesn't answer the totality of your question, but text is a whole different breed of problems just because it's eminently cut and pastable. With 3 words, plagiarism or misinformation is a paragraph, But there are small measures that I think might have an outsized effect over the next few years.
I mean, many courts are trying to decide that too, as you mentioned.
Yes.
To wrap up, I think, let's look toward the future a little bit. If both of you want to bring optimism, that'd be great, because I clearly am the massive cynic here. But what do you think the landscape will look like a few years from now? In the days leading up to this panel, I've been thinking a lot about when GPT-2 was released and kind of the fervor around that. I think it was 2020, right, or 2019, and everyone was concerned this would be a massive tool for disinformation, misinformation, and I suppose it ended up being that, but not very convincingly. Now it seems like the tools are so sophisticated, we are maybe reaching a point where it's getting hard to differentiate. So both of you, what do you think is on the horizon? Do we have reason to hope or not? I mean, Sarah, if you could go first.
Yeah, I'll give us a little bit of optimism, and I think my optimism comes from the fact that for generative AI companies, the business models are fundamentally different than they were for social media companies, or the current social media companies, which were, previously and still are the bigger focus of, concern and regulation around mis and disinformation. It seems we've pivoted and are now hyper-focused on, okay, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, what are you doing to safeguard your generative AI models from mis and disinformation? So social media companies, traditionally, their business model is built around engagement. So misinformation is highly engaging. It's very clickable, it's very shareable, it incites an emotional reaction, and so spreading misinformation actually feeds to their business model, so their incentives are misaligned. But with generative AI companies, their content needs to be trustworthy, otherwise people won't use it. If it continues to hallucinate, if it continues to propagate misinformation, if it continues to not cite sources, that's going to be less reliable than whatever generative AI company is making efforts to make sure that their content is reliable. And I'm heartened to see companies like Anthropic that from the start are building in ethics and responsibility into their business model. So I'm hoping that fundamentally the economic incentives will lead us to a better place, but we'll see.
Right, they're at least trying to. Whether or not they're successful is another question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the coming years, Kyle, we will see the adoption of provenance technologies with all the foibles that you pointed out. Like if everybody doesn't use it, especially bad actors, is it effective at all? But I think ethical companies, governments, to the extent it's helpful, nonprofits like Witness, who we work with, I'm sure you know Witness as well, Sarah, who are trying to safeguard privacy-preserving technologies that give you enough information and context about media so that you can make up your own mind. In a few years, let's say, give me 5 years, if you will, I think we'll have a new kind of media literacy that we teach our kids and ourselves, which doesn't rely on looking at earlobes, but relies instead on understanding the context of the media you're consuming before you go ahead and share it. Second, I think, with robust provenance, simply knowing that something came from a camera and is news. Again, we're not saying this happened. You could fake something in front of a camera. But knowing that it is a photograph by whatever definition of photograph you use, and not wholesale generated by an AI, is something we're going to need. We don't have it yet, but it's going to be critically important. Without it, and I hope that governments and companies, private sector can come together and understand how necessary this is, because without it, there's this thing called the liar's dividend that many of you will have heard of, which is if every single thing you read, see, talk about can be called into question, then we don't have truth at all. It's not your truth or my truth. Like there's just no common ground to have productive discussions or exchange ideas, or maybe even be creative and have satire and community around those things. So I think increasingly I'm seeing and feeling optimism around companies, private sector, realizing the same thing that many of us did, a short time ago, and putting real effort into making it possible. So I'm optimistic as well.
Well, it's good to have counterpoints to the pessimism. I want to thank you both again for being on stage with me to discuss the incredible, fascinating, and terrifying at times topic of disinformation and AI. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.